Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 17th of March. I hope everyone has had a great week. I've had a terrible week trying to build a new desktop machine. It took me 3 days. Maybe I'll create a video just to go over just what a hideous nightmare it was. But as always, I have the chapters so you can jump to any particular update. And there's a lot of updates this week, so I'm going to have to go through them pretty quickly. In terms of new videos, I created a video all about HR-driven provisioning. So I have my HR system, and rather than me manually creating user accounts in Azure AD or AD, how can I integrate those systems so it's a very seamless flow and what other technologies may come into play? And then just a little video on what is nested virtualization. We're starting to see that term more and more. So what does it mean? And it's really not that complicated. Onto the new features. So now my Ephemeral OS disk. So Ephemeral OS disk means that instead of the OS disk of that machine being stored on Azure Storage as a managed durable disk, it uses the temp or cache space of the host it's running on. It's very low latency, but it's not durable. If I shut the machine down and I stop paying for that compute, then I will lose the content. But if it is stateless, if it's some sort of VM scale set, if it's an AKS container host running as part of a node pool, I don't care about the state of the OS disk, so that Ephemeral OS disk is very attractive. Well, now, if I turn on infrastructure at host, which means it's complete end-to-end encryption, it even encrypts the temp drive, the caches of OS and data drives. Well, now when I turn that on, I can now use a customer-managed key for the encryption of that OS disk. So that's a new option available to us. Azure Static Web Apps now have A record support. So remember, an Azure Static Web App is great for hosting your pre-rendered content. My HTML, my JavaScript, my images, my CSS files. It could have been generated by something else. It has managed function add-ins, so through a very simple /API / whatever the function name is, relative path, I can integrate with functions. Well, now it has A record support. So what this means, if I'm using Apex custom domains, i.e. just the root of a domain, saviltech.net, well, now it can create an A record instead of a C name. Some things don't let you use a C name at the apex, so now I could have an apex, a root domain, pointing to my Azure Static Web App. It does mean it now points to a particular instance, so there are some drawbacks with that. You can go and read the docs to find out more, but it is now an option for you. Also, Azure Static Web Apps now have database connections. So I just mentioned one of the great things about Azure Static Web Apps is I have this ability to have managed functions. I can do /API / and the function name, so I don't have to worry about how do I talk to my Azure function. Well, now if I have database connections, it's going to give me the same relative capability. There's going to be a /data-API endpoint. And what I can now do is I can set up using the data API builder, which we're going to talk about in a few updates time. I can just speak REST. I can just speak just GraphQL, and the data API builder will convert that to the actual communications, the SQL statements, to go and talk to Cosmos DB, to talk to Postgres, to MySQL, to SQL database. I, as the application, never speak database. I just speak REST or that GraphQL. So it's now available for my Azure Static Web Apps, and I just use that relative /data-API endpoint, and it's going to, behind the scenes, go and use that data API builder. So really cool ability now to go and hook into a database. AKS backup is in preview. Now, ordinarily, we don't think about backing up AKS. We think that our maybe durable or stateful data is in a different tier in a database, but sometimes I do have stateful information in my pods. Maybe I am such that I'm actually running some kind of database in a container, so I do care about backing it up. So what I can now do with this AKS backup is it has to be a persistent volume backed by Azure Disk, so it's a managed disk somewhere. And then through this AKS backup capability, it will hook into my backup vault to use as the orchestrator. So it's not going to copy the content to the vault. what it's going to use is an in-place snapshot, but then copy that content to blob storage. So backup's being used for the orchestration, the scheduling of the backups, but now I have that durable backup of the pods I specify. So that's now an option available to us in preview. The container log v2 schema we've talked about before, but this is essentially I'm using container insights and it's sending the data to a log analytics workspace. What the container log v2 schema does is instead of it being lots of different tables, now everything goes to this one table. And the attractiveness of that is actually a couple of things. It makes it simpler. My interactions, I now don't have to do cross-table queries and joins. It's just querying the table. But also, Log Analytics has a basic log type. Now, the basic log type is cheaper, but I can't do cross-table queries. Well, if now all of it is in the same table, I don't need cross-table queries, so I could use the basic type and save myself money. So I can go and change this. It's an AKS cluster level. It's part of the config map of the cluster. And I can say, hey, I want to use the v2 schema. And then durable functions can now use the managed identity to talk to storage. So it's just an identity-based connection instead of having to embed some secret as part of the connection string. AKS Edge Essentials. If I think about Kubernetes, it can be a little bit heavy. So this is a really lightweight Kubernetes distribution. It's managed and supported by Microsoft, and it's designed to run on these edge devices that have limited resources. Think 4 gigabytes of RAM, only 2 virtual CPUs. So I might think a lot about IoT type devices where I want to run a container image. Maybe I've gone and trained a machine learning model. I need to just run it locally on a device. I need to run a container. With the AKS Edge Essentials, it hooks in to things like Arc for the control plane to get that management through the portal. I can still use kubectl. It's still CNCF compliant, but now it's this very, very lightweight to run on a huge multitude of devices. I can go and deploy my container images when I need to run them at the edge on some device, but it's still managed through the portal. Onto networking. So accelerated connections is available for network virtual appliances. Now, ordinarily, we have accelerated networking. With accelerated networking, if I think about the physical NIC, it has something called virtual functions. You can think of these as pseudo virtual network adapters. And with these virtual functions, the VM connects directly to a particular virtual function in the NIC. This bypasses the virtual switch, which means it's lower latency. It improves the overall performance. Well, this is now further enhanced. So if I'm using accelerated networking and then I turn on accelerated connections, it now achieves bare metal-like performance in terms of connections per second. I can get more out of the CPU, but overall use less of the CPU. So if I have very, very high traffic VMs, I can get the maximum stability, highest performance, reduced jitter for my virtual network, virtual appliances. Illumio for Azure Firewall is now in preview. So Illumio is focused on zero trust type segmentation for the network. And this is integrating into Azure Firewall. Remember, Azure Firewall is a managed appliance for my virtual networks. And it's then going to give me insight into both east-west traffic, so between the elements in my network, and then north-south coming in and out of the network. I can see the various interactions and dependencies in real time between all of the components, and then I can use it to configure app-based, so layer 7 policies based on tagging, but also I can run it in a what-if mode. So if I make this change, well, let's simulate the traffic flows and see what would happen. And it works across all 3 of the SKUs, basic, standard, and premium. Speaking of which, Azure Firewall Basic went GA. So Azure Firewall Basic is aimed at very small, medium-type organizations. It's very similar to standard, but it's only ever going to have 2 virtual backend instances, which impacts the scale it will support. I think it talks about up to 250 megabits per second of throughput. It only has threat alert mode. So it still gets the threat intelligence feed, but I can't create rules to deny on it. So those known bad IP addresses or URLs or fully qualified domain names, it will alert me, but I can't create rules that will deny based on that with the basic SKU. On the storage side, so we have Performance Plus for Azure Disk. This is for standard hard disk drive, standard SSD, and premium SSD. And it really just enhances the IOPS and the throughput for any disk over 513 gigabytes. So that pushes you to the next SKU. When it's 513 or above, it goes to the next SKU. And basically gives me better IOPS and better throughput. It doesn't cost me any more money. There's not really a downside to turning it on. So most of the time, you will use this. Today, there are a few features that won't work with it. Now, this obviously is in preview, but you can go and look, and what you see is this enhanced. So enhanced IOPS, and notice it's only when you go past 512. So it's 513 and above, but 513 would push you to this SKU, but the disk technically doesn't have to be 1 terabyte. So as it's 513 or more, it pushes you to this SKU which you're paying for. And then you can get these higher numbers if you turn on this new Performance Plus mode. So that's for standard hard disk drives. That's for standard SSDs. And it's for premium SSDs. So you'll see all of those 513 gigabytes and above, you can get that new mode available to you. Again, today in preview, I think there's a few things like backups a bit shaky with it. I don't know about Azure Site Recovery, but I would expect all of those to be resolved by the time we actually get to general availability. So generally no downside with that. And then UltraDisk is available in some new regions: Brazil Southeast, South Africa North, and UAE North. On to database. There's a lot in the database. Suppose PostgreSQL Flexible Migration as GA'd. So this gives me a seamless experience to migrate from my single server, that's the old model, to flexible server Postgres. So really all I have to do is I select the source servers. I put up to 8 databases in a migration task. I say, is it online or offline? And then I say go. So offline is going to be good if it's less than maybe 100 gigabytes and I can afford the downtime. Probably going to complete in less than an hour. Online, if it's bigger, I can't take that downtime. I can do that as well. But this is the path to get off of single Postgres and get to flexible, which is the go forward supported path. PostgreSQL Flexible has some new extensions. I'm actually not going to go through them, but it's PG Hint Plan and SemVer. So the PG Hint Plan just means I can give it hints about the execution plan it will use to execute the SQL comments to make it more efficient. And the SemVer is just semantic versioning, that major.minor.patch. It has that as a type within the database. So in the portal, I can go to server parameters, I find Azure extensions, and then I can check the box of the extensions I want. That's one of the great things about Flexible is I get far more control of all the parameters. I can do a lot more with it. Also, there are now performance workbooks for PostgreSQL Flexible. There's 2 templates available for me. I can think about there's both an overview and enhanced metrics. Now, they are templates. I can customize them, but it's going to give me this great visual reporting for the different metrics related to PostgreSQL Flexible. SQL Server Hybrid benefit now applies to the Azure VMware solution. So if I'm using the Azure VMware solution, which is that both VMware and Microsoft managed sets of VMware clusters running in Azure data centers, well, now I can run SQL Server on those using my existing licensing per the SQL Server Hybrid benefit. So it's just an efficient way to run that. Azure SQL Managed Instance Private Endpoint is in preview. Now, ordinarily, I would think about, well, Azure SQL Managed Instance runs in my VNet, so its endpoints are already in my virtual network. Why do I need a private endpoint? And it's really certain scenarios where maybe I'm offering some service where I need to access that database from a different virtual network. I don't want to peer them. Maybe I'm some kind of hoster. Maybe there's an IP addressing issue. I can't just connect them. Maybe it's that publisher consumer. But whatever the reason, I can now create private endpoints to an Azure SQL Managed Instance running in another VNet. So that's a preview. Sorry, GA. No, wait, it's gone. It's now a preview capability. And then Cosmos DB Analytical Store now has a changed data capture capability. So the Analytical Store in Cosmos DB it's fully isolated column store. So if I think about I want to do large-scale analytics against just operational data, I don't want to run that against my regular Cosmos DB transactional workload. It's going to impact the performance. So this Analytical Store is a separate, isolated store of that data. And what I can now do is with this change data capture, at no RU cost, I can get this continuous incremental feed of inserts, updates, deletes from that Analytical Store. I could then do whatever I want with that feed. I could transform it, flatten it, whatever I need to do, and write it to other types of targets. So that is now in preview. And then we mentioned it earlier. So the Data API Builder. So the Data API Builder is this open source project. And what it's going to let me do is, I think there's a picture in the GitHub. So this is what it is. If I think about, well, there's the backend databases. I configure this Data API Builder, which will then expose these REST endpoints and GraphQL endpoints. And my application just talks to these endpoints. It doesn't have to understand if it's a SQL on the back end, or Postgres, or MySQL, or Cosmos DB for NoSQL, or just regular SQL Server. I just talk REST or GraphQL. The Data API Builder then does the magic for me of converting it to the various SQL or whatever statements I need to talk to the back end. And then the results, it converts back to the REST GraphQL to give me that information. So because this is open source, I can run this anywhere. Yes, as we talked about, Azure Static Web Apps is providing this now as part of that solution, but I could absolutely run this on premises. I could run it anywhere I want. It's just a new solution that I can go and take advantage of. And then Azure SQL Database has offline migration in GA. So this is an extension for the Azure Data Studio. So I can now think complete end-to-end. It will go and do that analysis and readiness check of my database. SQL anywhere. SQL on premises, SQL in a VM, in Azure, another cloud. It will then give me right-size recommendations, and then it will actually perform an offline migration to Azure SQL Database. So this extension for Azure Data Studio will give me that complete end-to-end. And then finally, Azure SQL Shrink DB has gone GA. So this is really just focused on, I can use the DBCC shrink database to shrink data and log files with no impact to the database performance. So now I can go and do those maintenance activities without impacting my overall database. Miscellaneous. So Azure Chaos Studio has new regions, so East Asia. Remember, Chaos Studio is all about introducing via experiments. What if this failed? What if this load was really high? What if? I could build it into as part of my DevOps pipelines to test everything that's going on and see how my app responds. So now I can use it in new regions in preview. Azure VM Backup now has selective disk in preview. So it's a new enhanced policy. It's always going to back up the OS disk, but now if I have multiple data disks, I can say which data disk I want to be backed up with the OS. I can do this all directly through the portal, and it will only back up the disks that I have selected. Azure Monitor now has metric chart split by on multiple dimensions. So many counters we see, they have dimensions to them. Well, in the past, I could split by one dimension. Well, now I can split by multiple dimensions. And as I split it by multiple dimensions, I'll see a line item for each combination of that split. So for example, if my data was split by region, so East US and West US, well, I'd see two lines, East US, West US. Then if I could also split by another dimension, let's say API requests, well, I would see East US API request type 1, East US API request type 2, West US API type 1, etc. So I can now split on multiple dimensions. There are some new Azure Monitor audit policies. So if I think about auditing is critical to make sure my organization is getting the right compliance, I'm doing the right things. So what these new both policies and initiatives do is to help me make sure at a large scale, I have the correct diagnostic settings deployed to my services to make sure I am capturing the data I want, to make sure I then can get the correct policies, checking configuration to make sure I'm in compliance. Azure Container Apps have Azure Monitor integration. So Azure Container Apps sits on top of Kubernetes, but abstracts it away. It has Dapper for my microservices, lots of great capabilities. CADA for my scaling, network for blue, green, separating, splitting traffic. Abstracts it all of that away, and I as a developer can just write my microservice or other type of distributed application. Well, now it has Azure Monitor integration. And what that means is I can now use the familiar types of diagnostic settings to say, hey, my logs, I want to send it to Log Analytics. I want to send it to a storage account. I want to send it to an event hub where it could then be consumed, published, subscribed by some other SIM, or any of those other built-in third-party integrations with Azure Monitor now. So it's going to follow that standard configuration. Azure Load Testing, remember that's the managed Apache JMeter service to help me stress test my workloads. Well, now it has JMeter 5.5 support. So that means Java 17, that means Open Model Thread Group support, just available to me. And then just, not Azure, but I wanted to mention it. So Microsoft 365 Copilot was announced. And you've probably seen ChatGPT all over the place. And I did a whole 2 videos on what is ChatGPT and what are neural networks. And then I played around with ChatGPT. ChatGPT, remember, is just a really large language model trained on huge amounts of data. So this is not ChatGPT. This is from the Microsoft 365 apps. So I could think PowerPoint, Word, Excel, Teams, Power Apps. You now have this little Copilot. And it's going to help me do the tasks. It could be help me get started, help me draft content. It might help me take my content and summarize it or spruce it up or give me suggestions. I could have a Teams meeting and I join it late and I say, hey, catch me up. Or I can't attend the meeting and I can say, follow it for me. And it will then send me a summarization of what was said. Hey, I need a Power App. Create me a Power App that does this. So it's all about, I'm going to give a prompt, but what it's going to do is it's not just going to then send it to a large language model. It's going to take my prompt and it's going to do grounding. And what grounding means, it's going to improve the prompt so that when it feeds it to a large language model, I'm going to get a richer, better response. So that grounding is then going to go and talk to Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph is the standard API that has access to all of our data, our content. So it can take my prompt, enrich it with other data, tweak the prompt, maybe attach other data to it, and then send it to the large language model, get the response back, do post-processing on it, maybe mix it with other content through the graph again, and then send it back to my application. That's going to give me this really nice set of capabilities. It really is impressive. You should go and check it out. They've got some videos of things they're doing with this. But then separately from just the per app things, it has business chat. So think as business chat, I can interface with it different ways. It's an interface into all of the knowledge that you have over all of your Office estate. It's a navigator for everything you've done. So I can just ask it, hey, where are my notes on this? Create me a draft proposal on whatever this might be. What was the last set of communications about whatever it might be? Create me a proposal. So all of those tasks that normally are a little bit mundane, that take me time to do, the Copilot is there to help me. It may not get it exactly right. It's a Copilot. It doesn't fly the plane on its own, but it's going to help me draft, help me clean up the content, help me spruce things up, help me find where I am, help me give me next steps, just improve my overall productivity. And that was it. As always, I hope that was useful. Until the next video, take care.